Once orchestration students have learned the ranges and the technical basis of the individual instruments, then they're ready to learn the real craft of orchestration, how to combine them. Very often beginners are stymied by this problem. With so many people in the orchestra, how can I keep them all busy? And their default answer is often lots of doubling. The problem with this approach is that the more doubled sound you have, the greater the overall effect becomes. In general, the more instruments play together, the more they're constrained by the unavoidable realities of orchestral balance. For example, the brass can always dominate other families in the same register, so having the woodwind doubling the brass at the unison is pretty much useless. There are not that many ways to organize a tutti where everybody is really audible. The psychological principle called the contrast effect tells us that we quickly lose interest when what we perceive doesn't change. When everyone is playing most of the time, after a while nothing stands out. Whereas if, for example, the oboe hasn't played for a while, an oboe solo will be much more attractive when it arrives simply as novelty. If we've just heard a passage for strings, the brass or the wood will be fresh and much more effective when they arrive. If we think of the orchestra as a large group of people made up of many smaller groups or individuals, we can see right away that there are multiple possibilities for them to interact. And just as in a society, there are many kinds of interaction possible. For example, gentle dialogue, aggressive argument, one person or subgroup leading for a while the others are secondary, and so on. This kind of orchestration also arises from another basic principle of human psychology, perceptual planes of tone. While we can't follow four conversations of equal importance at the same time, we can still perceive things behind the main line even though they're less salient. Just as when walking in the forest, we can enjoy seeing all the trees, but we can also take pleasure in the birds chirping, in the wind moving the leaves, and so on. Let's look at some examples to see these principles in action. For this lesson, I've taken all the examples from my Sixth Symphony to avoid copyright issues. Our first example, from the last movement, illustrates one of the simplest and most common orchestral textures, a solo melody from one orchestral family, accompanied by harmony in another family. The oboe solo here is accompanied by the harmonic bass and middle voices in the strings. The harp chord and the pizzicato and the double bass act like a kind of trigger for the phrase. Our next example is from the first movement. This passage is a canonic dialogue between the upper strings and a solo trumpet. Since the trumpet is a very dominant timbre, the violins and violas play in octaves for more prominence. The second violins provide a harmonic background, divisi, so they're much less prominent, but they're still audible. When the answering phrase starts in measure 37, the violins are now doubled by the celli, while the background remains the same in the second violins. Notice also how the cymbals at the start and the pizzicato basses in measure 37 set off the phrases. They don't play throughout the phrase, as their role is not an accompaniment, but again as a kind of trigger. Now another example, again from the first movement. This example shows various interactions between several powerful groups. We start with a short phrase for horns and marimba. The marimba makes the attacks clearer and more aggressive. Then in the next bar there's an answer. Whereas the horns were in the middle register, now we're in the low register. Celli, double basses, and bassoons. The timpani reinforce key accents in this motive. Then three trumpets come in with yet another of the main motives in this movement. These quarter note chords act like a dramatic interjection, while the second motive continues below. As the phrase continues in measure 89, the faster motive that was first in the low instruments now rises up into a higher register. Then the horns return, now with violins and flutes also in a higher register. Now they're reinforced by the xylophone. Our next example from the second movement starts with the horns alone, then adds the upper winds playing counterpoint, and finally transitions to just the strings. Notice the way the strings overlap a bit with the winds. This is because this passage is rather lyrical, and abrupt contrast would have been too dramatic. Our next example from the third movement shows a certain kind of Tutti orchestration. Everyone is playing here, but not all playing the same thing. In measure 54 and 5, there are two planes of tone. The main line is in the low strings and the bassoons, and the upper strings fill out the harmony with static chords. Then the upper strings and brass enter with a kind of chorale. Notice that the spacing of the brass is different from the upper strings. The latter have a lot of divisi doubling over a 3-octave range and include the higher register, where the brass can't play at all. Then the first motive comes back in measure 58, but now in the high woodwind. The piccolo and the xylophone reinforce the woodwind. Without them, they couldn't compete with the brass. Then in the last bar, the chorale returns. Our next example from the fourth movement is an imitative texture for strings alone. The following example from the third movement is a mysterious texture with 3 planes of tone. The main line at the start is in flute 1, doubled by pizzicato violas an octave lower. The harp and the celesta provide another plane of tone. Note that the celesta doubles the harp an octave and a fifth higher. This is inspired by certain organ stops. Reinforcing specific harmonics can create new timbre. Flute 2 alone provides a subtle sustained background. Then the muted violins arrive. Now the flute line becomes background for a melody. The second violins add another layer of counterpoint, gently enriching the first violins. In spite of the limited number of instruments playing, the texture is rich because of these various planes of tone. And finally, an example of a full tutti as a climax. This is the end of the last movement, the culmination of the whole symphony. Here the main line is in the upper woodwinds and strings with lots of staccato leaps. The second plane of tone is in the contrabassoon, the low brass, and the low strings. The horns at a third plane later with some sustained chords in measure 216, and then a zigzag motive in measure 218 to 223. At the end in measure 223, the upper parts settle into a trill, creating more momentum, alternating with the zigzag motive. After this alternation repeats, we finally hear all the orchestral families together in measure 230 along with the crash cymbals. At the end, we have another tutti chord, this time with all the percussion, including for the first time the bass drum. This is the climax of the whole symphony. To sum up, it's best to see the orchestra as a society made up of many individuals and subgroups who each get their moment in the sun. Although they may play less often than if they were doubled, when they do play, the listener will notice them due to the contrast effect. And the various planes of tone, foreground, bassline, movement, and resonance, suggest ways to include everyone at different times. I would also mention that being at ease with counterpoint is essential to good orchestration. Not counterpoint in the sense of fugue, but rather as a way to render even the background planes of tone interesting for the players.